Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So this is a part 2 of an episode we're calling Trigger Warning, because we're hoping we can trigger you, or at least help you think about triggers. I mean, that's not really the intention of this. If you haven't listened to part 1, by the way, you should go back and listen to it, because we laid down some core principles that we'll be using in this episode to apply the idea of getting triggered to personality types. So let me just quickly do a kind of bullet list review of last episode in case this is your first episode you're listening to or watching. We talked a little bit about how we define triggers. First of all, we made a distinction between people that are dealing with like Vietnam level post-traumatic stress disorder, or maybe trauma from childhood that was like abusive and severe. We made the comment that those folks should probably seek medical, or not medical, but professional attention, help, therapy to get through things that trigger them around those events. And then we talked about, we're not really speaking to those. If that's you, please go get professional help for that. We're speaking to people more like Will Smith, who got triggered by Chris Rock saying something at the Academy Awards and responded in the moment. That's the level of trigger we're talking about.
Right. Like how this concept has now basically been inducted into the collective unconscious. Anytime somebody says or does, but generally says something that evokes an emotional response that for the individual is associated with something from their past.
Yeah. And then we talked about the ways people typically deal with triggers. The first is often to avoid it. Usually it's an attitude of avoidance. The second thing that happens is they try to control it by controlling the external world and circumstances to not get triggered. So if I can't avoid it, then I'm going to try to ensure no one triggers me. I'm going to try to control my environment as much as possible. If that doesn't work, often people go to reframing it, making it a bigger deal. Often they will, if you're triggered around something, you might make it a social issue or a cause or something that you take to an abstraction to reframe it so it's a bigger deal than just your personal issue. So that way you can feel like it's like the next level of trying to control the experience. And then finally, if none of that works, often what happens is people just go ahead and own it, identify or over-identify with it, and then tell everybody, look, this is just who I am. I can't get past this. I need the entire world to contort around me because this is just me now. It's an identity level experience. So we talked about that, and then we talked about shifting some of those, alchemizing those from the first of like avoiding to being open to being triggered. I would argue it's great to seek triggers out because they bring up a bunch of stuff we talked about last episode too. It brings up shadow material in our shadow, the shadow of our personality, the shadow of our psychology. A trigger will show us the unconscious parts of ourselves. Yeah. So I think we should be open gratitude toward those.
Yeah, and we might not actively seek them out, but we welcome them when they happen. And I mean, one could argue that looking for the things that trigger us and being honest about it is part of, quote unquote, looking for them. And if we are in a space where we're resourced and we feel pretty good otherwise, that might be the best time to seek a trigger, to pay attention to those things. But they're going to happen regardless. Everybody gets triggered. Yeah. So welcoming them as opposed to demonizing them.
And then when you welcome them and you're open to them, instead of controlling a situation that triggers you or the emotions that come up, it's learning the skill of being triggered, seeing the shadow material that arises, and then processing those emotions and those feelings and thoughts. Actually going through the process of working with them so that you can heal from them or overcome them. So we talked about one of the best skills you can develop is some type of emotional process, like EPR, emotional process release, maybe tapping, meditation, yoga, something that can help you process your emotions when they surface in your shadow.
And therapeutically, like cognitive behavioral therapy or, basically anything that encourages you to pay attention to the sensations in your body, pay attention to how we turn our thoughts into emotions, how we attach to our thoughts and emotions. And, there are so many different tools out there to help a person get through triggers that there's no lack of resources. And what's nice is you can find one that works for you, right? There's a whole host of them. And so it's a matter of being willing to process them and then finding the appropriate tools to get through. As with everything, triggers are a way out is through situation.
Yeah. And we talked about how the only person that can overcome the trigger is the person that has it. Like, no one outside of you can do the inner work that needs to be done to overcome some of the shadow material that's surfacing for you. You can rely on people like therapists and external tools to help you through the process, but ultimately, you are the only one that can overcome your own internal challenges. And so we talked about, again, being open, processing, basically instead of reframing, we talked about integrating. And then instead of being identity focused, we talked about disidentifying with them. You're not the sum of your traumas and triggers. You are a complete and whole person that also deals with some of this stuff that surfaces. And I think it's really exciting when triggers come into my life. It doesn't feel good. It feels awful. I hate it. And yet I'm grateful for it because it gives me the opportunity to say, wow, there's another part of my shadow that I didn't know about. There's another part of my unconscious that just became conscious. Yeah, it doesn't feel good to see it, but now I've got such a great opportunity. I have a glimpse into the shadow part of me. Just that alone is much to be grateful for. And I have an opportunity with that information to now do something about it. Whereas it was just in the shadows, maybe controlling me or influencing me from the shadows. Now that it's here in the light, now I can look at it. I can do something with this. So I think it's actually a good thing to be triggered in life, to have things surface from our shadow, and to focus on them, process them, release them, and continue that process going forward.
I think it should also be made clear, just to define the term a little bit, because this podcast is going to be talking about applying this concept to yourself and your personality type, or using personality type as an on-ramp to understanding a bunch of what we're talking about right now. And this idea of shadow can trip people up. So the shadow is effectively everything that you are unconscious. You lack awareness around your own identity. It is the parts of yourself that are still hidden from yourself. And shadow work is best done with what's called a psyche-to-psyche experience, which is that another person is mirroring you back to yourself. Almost by definition, we can't see what is in our own shadow. Like, that's why it's there. That's why we've put it over there for a reason. And if we were willing to see it, we would have brought it out of hiding. Like, we kind of need people to trigger us and be mirrors and ping back to us what's going on. So the shadow is all the stuff that we are unconsciously or is unconscious and we are unaware of. And so when a trigger happens, I think a person could say, well, I know the trigger is happening and I know I'm unhappy about it. So wouldn't that make me conscious of it and aware? But every situation, circumstance, emotion, like every trigger is the emergent of an entire system running. And what lives in the shadow isn't the trigger. And what lives in the shadow isn't the emotion around the trigger. What lives in the shadow is the system that's operating underneath it that causes that trigger to be an emergent. So when you get triggered, you have some work to do. You have a bunch of content living underneath the thing you just experienced. You have all of this content that now can be unearthed. And sometimes it's complicated. Sometimes it goes way back. Sometimes it's, beliefs and things that we were propagandized into thinking when we were very young. Sometimes it's a bunch of emotional stuff. Sometimes it's our relationship to ourselves and, our actual honest assessment about our self-worth and value. Sometimes it's, it lives beyond any of those. Maybe sometimes it's just narratives about reality or your paradigm or cognitive dissonance or all sorts of stuff. And that lives in these places. And the triggers are actually, in some ways, they're gatekeepers. They're gatekeepers preventing us from seeing all this content because it's an attempt to not have to look at it. And so the gatekeeper is doing its job when it gets triggered, but also it can't be there forever because what it's hiding is important information. So when we talk about getting triggered and then that gives you access to the shadow, and especially as we talk about this in terms of personality type, it's important to understand what we mean by what's in the shadow. It's not just ickiness, it's content. It's entire systems running of information about ourselves that we're turning our head every time it shows up. And I've been on about this. I've been on about this thing Carl Jung talked about. I've been basically using the word individuation like nonstop, endlessly for the past 6 months. In part because not that long ago, I went through a pretty deep, valley of deep shadow time period where I came out the other side understanding so much more about myself. And I think I finally had an experience of what it means to pursue individuation, to pursue it in the sense of individuation basically means something that can no longer be divided. And the reference to the original term is effectively of an atomic particle. Like it's been split as much as it can be split. That's it. It's a whole thing and it can't be split anymore. And individuation is a process of finding ourselves at a place where we can't be split anymore. Like there's nothing about ourselves that anything that's available to know at this time, we know. Now, it's a pursuit. It's a journey, not a destination. We're going to die before we fully individuate, but we can get closer and closer and closer. And shadow work is the way that we do it. We build bridges between our conscious and our unconscious mind so that messages can pass back and forth. And the stronger those bridges are, the less scared we are of the content we receive from our unconscious and from the shadow. The more we're willing to take that information in, the more individuated we become, like the less of a house divided we are. But when we get triggered and we let those triggers be gatekeepers and slam shut the doors and the passageways and the bridges between our conscious and our unconscious, the more we do that, the more we're a house divided. And so as we talk about this in terms of type, think about this in the using it in the concept of not just not being a pain in people's ass when they say something and you respond emotionally, right? That's usually where the conversation around triggers are. And we even kind of talked about that a little bit in the last podcast. If we're going to do the healing work that we need to do, then we're going to have to be resilient, right? We're going to have to be stronger. But in the course of using it to understand type and how we understand ourselves, this is less about like the services we're doing to humanity or for humanity. This is more about the service we're doing for ourselves. And when we allow ourselves to use triggers as a window or even as an arrow line to content in our shadow, it gets us closer to this place where we know ourselves, which I don't know anybody who doesn't want to know themselves more, especially if you're already into personality type. If you're into personality type, that's why you got into this gig in the first place, right? You wanted to know more about yourself. You want to understand your psychology. And triggers are ways, almost like cairns along the path. They're like arrows leading you to shadow content, stuff that you would not be able to access without them, without the mirror back to yourself. So I wanted to establish that principle before we move on and talk about it in terms of specific types.
So when we talk about personality types, and we connect triggers to personality, we also connect personality to the shadow Jung talked about. Dr. John Beebe has an 8-function model. So at Personality Hacker, we typically talk about the first 4 functions in someone's personality, technically called a cognitive function stack. We use a metaphor of a car, a 4-passenger car, and we have driver, co-pilot, 10-year-old, 3-year-old, dominant, auxiliary, tertiary, inferior. That's usually how we talk about type. It's an accessible model. It's a great way to get started. And we can talk about the growth path being grow your co-pilot auxiliary, make sure you're honoring your dominant. We go through all of these aspects of personality. But when we get to the last 4 cognitive functions that aren't in that car model or the first 4 functions of your personality, we're talking about shadow functions. Dr. John Beebe has an 8-function model, which function 5 through 8, he identifies as shadow functions. A couple interesting things, because we've been personally coaching with him and working with him, hiring him to basically teach us everything he knows, because he's not written that many books, and we want to learn as much as we can from the experts and all of the people that have come before, so we get the information correct. He talks about the inferior or 3-year-old function in the car model or in the stack as the access point to the shadow. It's the animus or anima of our personality, but it's also the access to the shadow material. So I thought today what we could do is focus the conversation from a personality type lens toward that 3-year-old or inferior function in the car model. Because Dr. Beebe talks about that as the access to the shadow, this would be a great place to start, because whatever triggers us there is probably a good place for us to recognize. It's probably something that you listening right now would recognize in yourself because it's such a childlike part of you. It's a part that can probably be easily triggered.
Yeah. Well, and this idea that it's an access point to the rest of the shadow, it's actually in a lot of Jungian theory, it's the beginning of the shadow.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of people are actually quite unaware of how they are impacted and affected by that inferior function, that 3-year-old function. And it provides a lot of shadow material. A lot of stuff around that is deeply unconscious, and in part because it's a very uncertain function. We don't know how to treat it. I've noticed that we tend to ignore it, or we obey it, almost as if it's a master over us. And that toggle back and forth between ignoring it and marginalizing it, meaning that we don't fully give it its due for how much it's impacting and affecting us and how much of a part of us it really is. So we do that 80-90% of the time, and then 10 to 20% of the time it is a taskmaster over us, and we believe we have to empirically obey it and the rules that are found in the aspects of life that it represents.
Yeah.
And so we have a very, it's a real push-pull relationship there.
And the reason is because we feel deeply uncertain in this part of us. I mean, imagine a 3-year-old moving through the world. They know how to walk, but they don't know how to do a lot more than physical things. A 3-year-old actually has 1 or 2 modes: deep uncertainty and fear and resistance, retraction, they don't go for things, or overconfidence. Sometimes 3-year-olds will walk out in front of traffic, moving vehicles. They don't have the cognition to say, "Oh, that's dangerous for me." They overdo one or the other as well.
But they do remember when their hand has been slapped away from something.
Yeah.
Right? They're not allowed to touch the stove, and they know that their hand has been slapped. So that is a rule. So if you go near the stove, they'll freak out because that's the one rule they know.
Yeah.
And so that uncertainty also leads to
oversimplified conclusions.
Oversimplified certainty, or you said, conclusions that we obey empirically because we don't know what rules we can. There's not enough foundation to know what rules can be disobeyed or ignored or neglected. All the rules that have been learned must be empirically obeyed. And so in some ways we almost, we hand over all this power to it. We hand over an insane amount of, we hand over a lot of power that we don't know is actually associated with our need to identify with it. The 80% that we're kicking over here is actually the terrain we need to be exploring, and the 20% that we're empirically obeying, we need to kind of let go of a little bit of that empiricism. But it's really hard to get that right, and that's why it's the beginning of the shadow.
Yeah.
Because so much about our relationship to it is so deeply unconscious.
Do you want to dive into this? How do you want to organize? You want to do this by the firm model?
Yeah.
It's probably the best way. So we just start with the freedom fixation. So
sure.
4 personality types that typically are obsessed with freedom, they have a fixation on freedom, are the EP types.
Right. And if you're wondering what the firm model is, we've done entire podcasts on it. It's just a way of organizing the 16 types into 4 different categories: freedom, invulnerability, rightness, and management. Freedom are the 4 EP types. So ENTPs, ENFPs, ESTPs, and ESFPs. I stands for invulnerability, which are the 4 IJ types. So that'd be ISTJs, ISFJs, INTJs, and INFJs. And then R stands for rightness, which are the 4 IP types: INTPs, INFPs, ISTPs, and ISFPs. And then finally, there's the managers, the management type, which are the EJs. So that would be ESTJs, ESFJs, ENTJs, and ENFJs. So as you hear us go through this model, it's a model that talks about our relationship fundamentally to our driver or dominant function, but you can find podcasts on the subject if you want to look it up at our website.
Yeah. So let's just take the freedom fixation EPs for a second here. There's 4 of them. Now, they all have, 2 of them have the same inferior or 3-year-old function, and the other two have the same inferior or 3-year-old function. So the ENPs, like yourself and myself, Antonia, you're an ENTP preferences, I have ENFP preferences. That means both of our dominant or driver cognitive functions in our personality, we have the same, is going to be extroverted intuition, exploration, but that means that our 3-year-old or inferior is also going to be the same for both of us. Introverted sensing or memory, we've nicknamed it. And introverted sensing memory, when it's done well, is all about precedent, about what's come before, about verifiable, reliable, expert information, about standardization, about history and procedure and a through line over time. So it's very timeline focused. And I would say that a lot of times it's represented in totems of life. Like we usually use physical totems to represent memories and other things that impact us as people.
Yeah, it's an understanding of who we are based on where we've come from in a lot of ways. And I would say that ENP types get triggered by this part of themselves all the time. And that's really good information. If you get triggered by something in your 3-year-old of introverted sensing or inferior of memory, this is usually a signal that you need to be paying more attention to this part of who you are and working on integrating it. Now, integrating it is giving something space to exist. It's giving yourself an ability to appreciate the influence this function has over you and to have a little bit more discretion over whether or not you're totally ignoring it and acting like it's not you, or whether or not you're empirically obeying the very few messages you've picked up about it, right? The aspects of it that you've decided are important to you. And so anytime you get triggered in this part of yourself as an ENP, it usually is a simple, go pay attention to this part of who you are. Now, each of these functions, each of the 8 functions actually do a lot of things, right? They cover a lot of territory in life. And so this can be anything from your relationship to objects from the past, right? And what they actually truly mean to you, all the way up to your personal history and how you are impacted by your personal history and whether or not you're denying its influence over you. It could do with your relationship to institutions and infrastructure, like the things that have already been established, and whether or not you're, an anarchist damn the man style and you just want to push that away, or you're a person who's maybe like overly reliant on institutions. And it can also have to do with basically the continuity of your life and whether or not you feel like there is a through line to your life, or whether or not you feel like you're just kind of jumping around like a wildfire and have no sense of responsibility or rootedness.
I have a quick story example of this. Every time I go home for the holidays to my family's house and my parents have made a change, like they may have repainted my childhood bedroom or they make an adjustment to the house, I find a triggering emotional moment in these. I'm like, like you're ruining something I remember from my childhood. You're taking away totems that I remember, and I can have this emotional trigger moment for me of emotions I have to process around that, which is crazy. Right now, I've been through this enough that I think I've got the mechanisms in place. I'm talking a little bit more of an older version of myself that was more traumatized or triggered around this. But that's an example of how this function might be triggered in a personality type similar to mine, either an ENFP or an ENTP.
I remember your brother one time telling me I think it was like Thanksgiving or something. And we were having a conversation about our the religion that I grew up in versus the religion you grew up in, and contrasting. And your brother, who has ESFP preferences, he said something I think that he thought was almost honoring. He said, because I said, no, I don't believe it at all, right? Like they were like, do you believe anything? Anything left of your past? And I was like, nope, not anything. I completely restructured all of that. And he goes, oh, I think that you believe some of it. There's got to be some of it with you. And I think that he was actually saying that in an introverted feeling, authenticity sort of way. Like there's got to be a continuity, like I think introverted feeling likes to believe that there's always something of it that lasts through all of the different changes of life and all the different cycles. Yeah. Like there's like a core whatever
identity.
Yeah, like a core self that just lasts through the whole thing. And I think that he was trying to indicate this as a sense of continuity in my identity. I don't get easily triggered. I very rarely get triggered, but I remember kind of being offended. I was like, no, Jason, nothing. I've kept nothing. and I got offended. Like I kind of got, I mean, I didn't show it because I have enough extroverted feeling or harmony not to like, go like, what do you mean by that? But I had to really think about that. Why was this offensive? Why was I triggered by it? Why did it give me an emotional response? Why didn't I just go, okay, well, that's your opinion of how humans work, and that doesn't match my experience, so whatever. Why did I get offended and triggered by it and emotional around it? And I realized it was because I was still close enough to the experience of having left, like it was within a 3 to 5 year cycle of me having left, that I hadn't yet revisited my youth to ask me how it actually did still have a hold on me. Like I didn't necessarily, quote unquote, believe the doctrine, but what was still cloying to me? What was still echoes of the past? How was I still being framed by this paradigm and the ways that it was going to probably influence me for the rest of my life? I hadn't made peace with that yet. So when he triggered that emotional response in me, what he basically did is he said, there's a bunch of stuff inside of you that hasn't made peace with your history. You have not yet worked out what your relationship to your past is yet. So you probably should go do that at some point. And what a gift, right? Because then I was like, all right, I guess I have some work to do. Rolled up my sleeves, tried to figure out, okay, what are the things that I've been keeping? And a lot of the stuff that was still there, it wasn't really doctrinal. It was more like values that I hadn't let go of and ways I saw myself, but it was more the things I was throttling. Like I was not giving myself permission to take honest actions for myself because I was still pitting against values and things that I had been told were inappropriate when I was young. And that was the big deal. Like the big deal was that I was denying myself things and I was throttling things that should not be throttled. And that was, that it took actually probably a couple years for me to really fully process that entire thing. So when we talk about processing triggers, we're not talking about like,
just get over it. Just get over it. That's not what we're saying.
Go get yourself in a sensory deprivation tank and, maybe do a little tapping on the forehead and it's going to be fine. You're going to be fine. No, we're like, process that and figure out the system underneath. It might take some months to really get through whatever was going on. And also that was all available for me. Aspects of who I am, all this content around who I am as a human being was all just waiting for me to look at it. Parts of me that were rearing to go and have experiences I was denying myself having because they would be somehow inappropriate, even though they had nothing to do with appropriateness and hadn't since I was a kid. But they were all waiting for me, kind of hitting at the gate, going like, let's go. Yeah. So those are the kinds of triggers we're talking about. We're talking about like moments when somebody says something that just hits you or an awareness hits you of how much content is waiting for you to look at.
Yeah. Let's get a faster pace so we can get through all of these.
Okay. That was an example and bring that example to your life and to your type.
Exactly. And I'm glad we started with us because we got to give 2 personal examples to kind of illustrate what we're talking about. Let's look at the other 2 EP types, the ESFP, the ESTP. Now, these 2 types share a 3-year-old inferior function of introverted intuition is the technical name. We've nicknamed it perspectives. When it's done well from a personality type that uses this as a strength, it's about shifting into other people's perspectives. It's about creating meaning, understanding the implications of things, long-range thinking and timelines, looking into the future, with prediction to say this is probably what will happen down the road. And so often ESPs, ESTPs, and ESFPs report that, and if they have to think about the future or anything that's future-oriented or the meaning or implication of something, sometimes that can create lots of anxiety for them. So I think for these 2 types, often triggers can come from things like that, like meaning, future pacing, the future plans one might have. This can probably be very much something would surface the shadow material.
It's also about symbology. There's a lot of elements here that help us sort of understand. Well, I think in order to get a lot of that unconscious information, we talked about a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. Sometimes that stuff comes in like dreams and symbols. And so access to the darker parts of who we are, and darker as in the shadow, not necessarily like the dark parts of the heart, right?
Not bad motivation, but like difficult thoughts.
Exactly. Difficult things to make peace with. It can be for an ESP triggering to have somebody, question anything about them, trying to get inside their mind, trying to understand their psychology. Because who knows what they'll find in there, right? If you've got a sense of uncertainty, like deep uncertainty around anything that you haven't personally engaged with, well, then if somebody comes up and like wants to sort of crack that nut, you're going to be all triggered. You're going to be like, I don't think I want you going inside there and seeing all this stuff that I haven't seen. So in some ways, that 3-year-old or inferior function is like maybe the most pure expression of the gateway to the shadow when it's introverted intuition or perspectives, because it is a function all about symbology and dreams and interpretations and understanding one's own mind form patterns and access to the deep unconscious, and then access to how that relates to the rest of symbology and the rest of the collective unconscious. And so in some ways, ESPs have an almost pure expression of that gatekeeper or that bridge to the shadow. But they can be equally, like you mentioned, they can be equally triggered when somebody goes, so what's your 20-year plan? And then like their brain sort of like, the gears get all clogged up and they don't even know. And then they get upset that they don't know and don't make me think about that. And so in those moments, oftentimes it's about like, I don't have a plan, and have I made peace with that? Is there something inside of me that tells me I'm supposed to know all of this? And what do I actually want to know about myself? Is it what my mission is, my purpose? Is it a narrative about my life? I might not need to plan every step, but do I need to sort of understand what my through line is, not from behind, but into the future? And what haven't I figured out that I instinctively know that I should be paying attention to?
One thing I've noticed about ESPs is if you insinuate something around their mindset, their intuition, the mindset, this can be deeply unsettling. It can cause a trigger, like the implications of something or how they're thinking about something. Like, oh, well, maybe you're not thinking about it. You're maybe like if I say something to an ESP, like, well, I mean, you're inferior intuition, so you might not be seeing the pattern. That can be very triggering because it's like, well, am I deficient now? Like it makes them feel something like they're not good enough in this way.
Yeah, I think actually a lot of types have this challenge. But I think with ESPs, I am surprised by how many of them in profiling sessions report that they're overthinkers.
Yeah.
And so if you imply that an ESP has not put enough thought into something and that they're going to face terrible consequences because of it, that might be also triggering because they're trying to pull themselves out of being overthinkers. Yeah. They're trying to pull themselves out of being trapped by that 3-year-old function.
Yeah. All right, let's go to the IJs. So freedom, I in firm stands for invulnerability. All the IJs, these are INFJs, INTJs, ISTJs, and ISFJs. Let's start with the intuitive folks. The INFJs and the INTJs are both going to share a dominant driver cognitive function of that, what we just talked about, the ESPs, introverted intuition perspectives. And again, this is about perspective shifting, long-range implications, timelines, or looking into a long timeline down the road. On the opposite side of that, the 3-year-old or inferior cognitive function for these two types is extroverted sensing. We've nicknamed it sensation. Sensation, when it's used by a personality type that uses this as a strength, is all about the present moment, about the 5 senses, but also beyond that too, the present sensory environment. It's taking a single perspective, the here and now. It's not time shifting to the future at all. And it's very aware of what's happening in this space, in this moment. And this is going to be a little bit of a challenge for INJ types. Like they often struggle in this area, and they can build skill here, obviously, but there's deep uncertainty about the present moment, about a single perspective, about all of these things, about the ability to generate energy really is one of the things I think a lot of INJs struggle with is, will I have this part of me that tends to generate energy? Will I have the energy I need for when I get to the moment I need it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that sometimes triggers don't always look like a fence. Sometimes they look like avoidance, right? Well, I mean, that's what the first, port of call for trying to get around a trigger is to just avoid it. And as types that are focused on invulnerability, there's going to be a lot of avoidance behaviors. But I do see that INTJs have a tendency to get more offended by this idea of they're not moving fast enough. like if you try to push them. Because extroverted sensing or sensation, one of the superpowers it gives to people who use it is the energy to be in motion and the willingness to get on things quickly. And for INTJs, if you're like, you're dragging your feet, your life is going by without your involvement. Like you are not going, like you need to get into action. There can be this sense of like staying put, right? And not budging and getting offended that the other person is implying that they're not moving fast enough, that they need to be at their own pace.
Yeah. Another one of these, I had an INTJ friend of mine get angry. He had been drinking alcohol. Clearly to me, he was intoxicated and inebriated. But to insinuate that to him suggested that he didn't know his own body well enough to register it. He was in denial. He didn't have a good read on it. He didn't know he was inebriated. He was actually attempting to drive at the time. And I was like, no, that's not going to happen. Deeply offended because the idea is like, I should know my own body. I should know when I've had too much to drink.
Yep. I think that's a big one too. And then I think this tends to be more of an INFJ challenge, but it's a self-consciousness around overindulgence. Like I remember suggesting to my INFJ mom one time that she should exercise more. And she was very offended by that. She let me know that she gardens and she goes on walks, and that's as much as she needs. And so there was this sense that that she didn't, like it was just kind of offensive that I would say that she needs to take care of her body more. But the other one I've noticed more for INFJs than INTJs, but I think it could probably cross or go both ways, is this idea that they've missed something. Right. I remember an INFJ that I knew was very offended by my insinuating that they had missed something about somebody, that they hadn't been paying attention. And I think that there is kind of this idea, when we're consciously in our dominant function or driver, like when we know we're playing that side, when we're sort of, an INJ is sort of in their own heads and sort of lost there, and you go, you missed a detail, they'll own that immediately, right? Yeah. They'll go, yes, I know, I missed it. But if they were paying attention, if they didn't think they were in that spot and they were paying attention, and then you insinuate that they missed some stuff, that can be deeply offensive. Like, what, you think that I don't have the ability to, to catch everything I'm supposed to catch? And a lot of times INJs are actually overconfident in their ability to catch things when they're paying attention. And that's not always the case, right? They can miss a lot of stuff. And so, and just by saying that probably is triggering some INJs out there. Like, what do you mean? I'm not missing anything. So there's a lot of different aspects that this can show up for INJs, that they're not present, they're not in their body, they're not taking care of their health, they need to get into action faster. This is where they gain their energy from, and that they're missing that detail, that this is a place of energy, that this is a place where they need to be present, grounded, right? They're too in their heads, which they'll acknowledge when they are aware they're in their heads. But if you insinuate that when they've been trying to be more grounded, well, then that's a place that could be triggered or triggering. And that's a bunch of content. What's the relationship you're missing with your body? What's the relationship you're missing with your health? How is life passing you by? What are the opportunities you're missing because you're still in your head? Like, there are life is going, right? It is on its way, and it is going to pass you by until you get into the action. And so all these things are really rich material for an INJ to make peace with, as opposed to saying, I should be able to do it in my time. Well, a lot of times triggers are there because you're trying to convince yourself first. So where are you lying to yourself? Where do you have dissonance? What's your relationship to your body? Are you truly healthy? Or are you just saying that because you're comparing yourself to other people whose standards are even lower than yours, right? Like, really, what is the truth for you as an individual without all of the retconning and without all of the mental gymnastics?
Also, just want to highlight what we talked about again in the last episode, and we just quickly went over this episode, the idea of avoid, control, reframe, or own and amplify. Each of these types are probably going to tend to one of these. Like you mentioned, Antonia, INJs might be more avoidant, or all IJs might be more avoidant as a strategy. Whereas like when we talk about EJs, it's probably more about control. We're going to typically use what we're strong in order to deal with this. And when I say that, I mean INJs are very strong in reframing things, seeing a different perspective. So I think the example of your mom was she was actually using her dominant driver function to reframe exercise and all of this to be gardening and taking a walk. and that can be exercise. That's not what I'm saying. It's just she was reframing what you were saying, which was more intense exercise, maybe strength training and resistance or endurance training. She was perspective shifting to say, well, I am doing those things through these activities over here. So also be watching for how we tend to latch onto one of these strategies more than the others, most likely, also based on our cognition. Let's talk about the ISTJs and ISFJs in the IJ framework. So ISTJs and ISFJs both share a dominant driver function of introverted sensing. We've nicknamed it memory. It's all about, again, past experience, precedent, what's come before, standardization. And they both share an inferior or 3-year-old cognitive function of extroverted intuition. We've nicknamed it exploration. This is the function Antonia and I use. It's all about external patterns in the real world. It's about putting two seemingly disparate things together and finding the connection point. People that have this as a strength can do it even when there is absolutely no connection point. We can somehow find a connection point between disparate things. That tends to be what we do with our pattern recognition. We find possibilities, what-if scenarios. We like to open up ideas, throw spaghetti against the wall, brainstorming sessions. This is when it's done as a strength. Now, when it's an inferior or 3-year-old, all of those same capacities lie there, but the skill might be less developed, and certainly there is uncertainty here in this place for ISJs.
Well, and it used to be in the past that ISJs were not as encouraged to be in this space. Like even probably, I would say 20 or 30 years ago. There was a lot of technologies coming down the pike quickly, but not like it has been the last 30 years. Not since the invention of the internet in the last 40 years. So, or accessible internet. And so I think that this is almost like new territory for ISJs, at least in our culture in some ways. Now they have to keep up. Now ISJs have to keep up like crazy with a bunch of technologies that are changing things so fast. But I think what can happen, and the one place that I've seen this the most that is triggering to like ISJs, particularly in a work context, is I've heard multiple times ISJs complain that when they bring up new ideas, nobody's listening to them, right? Like they have this new idea for how something could work. They bring it forward to their boss or in a meeting and just nobody listens, right? And that can be really triggering. It can be very upsetting. Like they thought about this, like they brought this new idea forth. And sometimes, and it really is shadow work, sometimes they'll explain it away by other, socio-political ways, right? It's their demographic. I remember an ISTJ woman complaining that her boss never listened to her and assumed it was because he was sexist. But come to find out, he was basically hiring and promoting a bunch of women that weren't her. And so I said, well, how do you reconcile those two ideas? Is it actually misogyny? Is it actually sexism? Or is it something else? And she's like, well, I can't think I can't think of what else it would be. And I asked her how much that she had put into speaking persuasively and marketing herself, how much she had put into communicating in a way that was assertive, right? That made him pay attention. Because one of the things that extroverted intuition or exploration can do is it markets itself. It has a good idea, or it has an idea, whether or not it's good, right?
They're all good ideas, Antonia.
All 4,000 of them that I thought about in the last 3 minutes. So you've got all these ideas, and one of the things that an ENP in particular has to learn to do throughout their life, and INPs if they're really developed, is that they sell their idea. They don't just come up with it, but they market it, they persuade, they get people excited around it. They use it as an organizing principle and galvanize people around it. But when it's a 3-year-old or inferior function, you don't always have that awareness. And so when you put an idea out there, it's like this beautiful, fragile little baby. And if nobody pays attention to it, it can be really triggering and very upsetting, right? And then the person will go into hiding because they're invulnerable, and then they'll avoid that situation again in the future and explain it away in other means. But there was all this shadow content for her to ask herself, why am I not marketing myself? Why am I not promoting myself more? Why am I not learning the communication skills to persuade another person to see my side of my idea? And that was the integration work that needed to be done.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. I think another good example of something that can trigger ISTJs and ISFJs is a challenge or possibility thinking around a deeply held belief system or value structure. So for example, someone that might present new information, new pattern or new connection about, let's say, something about evolution that would now show a religious belief to possibly not be true, could be deeply triggering for an ISJ because this is something that they have believed, and now you're introducing new information that might contradict a deeply held belief. And I think that could trigger a lot of emotional stuff from the shadow.
I know almost every ISJ that I know that has changed paradigms because they had new information come to them that they couldn't unsee has had to do so with some great anger. Like it was very unsettling to them that they had to make these big changes. And it was done with a lot of frustration and anger. And usually the reasons satisfy their judging function, their co-pilot of extroverted feeling, harmony, or extroverted thinking effectiveness. But that already deep uncertainty about changes and disruptions and things that are going to mess up their lives and break up the continuity and the familiarity of what they know, that's maddening. And I think that can be, I think you're right. There can be a lot of trigger around that. And I think there's also almost like a way where you wouldn't think this is a trigger, but if there's a lot of sense of hope, if they're really attached, if an ISJ is really attached to a sense of hope with their 3-year-old or inferior function, and you try to take that hope away from them, if you try to say, like, it's just not going to work out this time, that can be massively triggering. And again, there's a bunch of content under there. Like, what are they pinning their hopes on that they're not actually setting up their life to accomplish? What are they hoping will just happen somehow? And there's usually a lot of information in there around things that they need to be doing and manifesting themselves with their actions. Just like the person who was like, why didn't they listen to my idea? And it's like, well, because you need to be more persuasive, right? You've got work to do. And almost always these triggers are pointing to, inner work, inner growth, skills we have to build, cognitive dissonance that we have to reconcile somehow. There's usually content underneath there that needs to be addressed.
So let's move over to the IPs next. INFP, INTP, ISTP, and ISFP. I think I got all 4 of them, right? All these letters are flying around. Sometimes I get confused. Let's talk about the ISTP and the INTP first, because they share the same driver, dominant function, and the same 3-year-old inferior function. So we talk about ITPs. They both share the driver, cognitive function, the dominant cognitive function of introverted thinking is the technical name. We've nicknamed it accuracy. It's about internal logical consistency. It's about what makes sense to the individual, what makes sense. It's about atomizing information down to its component parts and working with the information as it is, not in a narrative fashion, not in the story of that information, but what is the truth of the information I'm working with. In the backseat, at the 3-year-old or inferior level, both of these types share a cognitive function technically called extroverted feeling. We've nicknamed it harmony. That's its goal, to create harmony in the world. If you use this as a strength in your personality, you're going to be focused on things like social interaction, human dynamics, relationships, how people are feeling, the needs of the people around you and maybe the world at large, boundaries, all these, manners, all the different things that people do going through the world and how kind they are, nice to each other. These are things that this function is focused on when it's being used as a strength. And it's still somewhat focused on all these things, even at a 3-year-old or inferior place in a personality. Again, it's just that uncertainty comes in. Doesn't really know what to do with it. Maybe there's some black and white thinking here. Maybe it's a little overdone or underdone, but definitely uncertain.
Yeah, in some ways, it's almost easier to see how we get triggered by our judging functions. The judging functions being the feeling and the thinking functions. Our sensing and intuition functions are a little harder to put our finger on.
More nuanced.
Yeah, a little bit. Like, because they tend to not pack as much a punch as our judging functions does when it comes when we're like, that should or should not be that way. So I think it's almost easier to understand how an ITP is experiencing their triggers than it is all the previous types we've mentioned. So extroverted feeling or harmony is about, like you mentioned, all those things around relatedness. But one of the emergence that comes up is unspoken social contracts and connections and friendships. And so I think with ITPs, it's not hard. You don't have to scratch very far underneath the surface to see an uncertainty around relationships, and especially their ability to blend with society or to say the right thing in the right moment. But a lot of ITPs have just gone, well, that's stupid. I don't care about that anyway. And then they outsource it to other people. But the real sensitivity, I think, and the trigger comes around a lot of times two major things. The first one is their ability to maintain relationships and not eventually have everybody hate them. That's the story of a lot of ITPs. A lot of it is everybody eventually hates me. And so they self-censor. They do a lot of things that, sometimes they create codependent relationships. They try to maintain the people in their lives if at all possible. And they usually have a story around how everybody goes, right? Eventually, I'm going to say something, you're going to leave my life. Or I have to bend over backwards to keep you there. And the sensitivity will show up in fights, conflict, when somebody accuses the ITP of being heartless, of saying something mean, of showing up inappropriate, of not knowing how to act. You can't read a room, right? You're tone deaf. If they're in a space where they're trying to relate to the other person, that hits them right where it counts. Now, if they're in their thinking process, they don't care. Just kind of like the intuitive, when they're in their intuitive process, doesn't care that they're missing sensory details. But if they're in a space where they're paying attention and you accuse them of not doing it, well, now it's sensitive. And the same thing with ITPs. If they're in a place of connected relatedness, and then the person they're in a relationship with, quote unquote, goes on the attack around this, right? Accuses them of insensitivity, saying the wrong thing, being unkind, or being unable to keep friends, or just maybe attacks the friendship itself or the relationship itself. Oh, that is very triggering to an ITP. That's the first one. The second one tends to be around social rules. If they've learned a social rule, and if it has been inculcated into them to care about those social rules, man, you want policemen for social rules? Get an ITP that thinks it's really important to obey them. And they'll be rigorous about obeying them themselves if they think that this is important, because they're always trying to, in some ways, they're trying to offset the other reputation that they don't know what they're doing here. And they can overcompensate by being a little too obedient to these social rules.
What better way to demonstrate competency in a social situation than to get triggered when a rule or something that's expected is broken? Well, that's a great way to demonstrate, because I think ITPs in particular love to demonstrate competency. I want to be competent in all things, they might say to themselves. You might say this if you're an ITP listening. And so, well, the social rules out there told you this is how it goes. So to display competency here, I respond in this way. I get triggered when someone says this about this social thing, whatever.
Right. Yeah. And that's not, I think some ITPs think that this is them getting really good at their 3-year-old function of extroverted feeling or harmony. In fact, I would say that a lot of these, the triggers or the being protective around how people are experiencing those functions is a lot of times what people think of when they say, well, I'm good at this part of who I am. But really, all we've done is handed ourselves over to it as a taskmaster. We just obey it implicitly, right? We're like almost worshiping it at this point and not crossing it. And so that's not really an integrated experience. And that's why when you accuse them of not being great at it, even though they've worked so hard, or if you offend one of those rules and they jump in and get triggered in its behalf, that's how you know it's shadow work, right? It's not an integrated part of who they are. It's shadow, right? It's unconscious around the systems going on underneath that need a person to understand that, well, no, social rules are not meant to be implicitly protected. And just because this is your culture doesn't mean that a person who's entering it and is unaware of the rules is somehow gauche or, is unable to keep up with social propriety. It's like, well, that's just your version. There's a lot of them. And so I think that's something that can really come up for ITPs.
What word did you use? Gauche? I've never heard.
Gauche, I think, is actually how it's supposed to be pronounced. Gauche.
I don't know what that means.
Gauche, I think.
I've heard it before, but I honestly don't know what it means.
I probably mispronounced it.
I do this all the time. I use words that I don't, but now I'm going to start using it, and just hopefully someone will tell me what it means. But you know what it means. It means...
Well, I mean, it's like, in the context of how I used it, it's like, it's like you're a person who doesn't, you're kind of...
not with it.
Well, yeah, you're like, you're sloppy. You're
Gotcha.
like sort of socially sloppy and but I don't know, because now that I've used it and you called it out, I'm like waiting for somebody to be like, you've totally used the word gauche in the wrongest way possible.
I remember that years ago. Somebody was like, you can't use beg the question the way you're using it, Joel. That's not the accurate use. And I'm like, but that's how I've always used it. I always see it on TV used that way. Like, how is it? So I use words I see used.
Somebody recently came after us for using the word professional in a way they didn't like. And it was like, really? Okay.
Did we trigger you?
Are you triggered around the word professional?
Let's talk about the other two IP types. So these are INFPs and ISFPs. Now, both of them are going to share a dominant or driver function of introverted feeling, technically called. And we've nicknamed it authenticity. It wants what is the most authentic expression of an individual. It's interested in things like motivation, drives, the human experience, all of the internal emotional responses and understandings based on moving through the world. This is what this function does well. The opposite of that, which is the 3-year-old for both ISFPs and INFPs, is technically called extroverted thinking. We've nicknamed it effectiveness. This, when it's used as a strength, is focused on metrics, outcome, applying thinking to the outside world, like the actual physical world around us. And it's about getting results. It's about finding what works and delivering a result at the end of the day. IFPs can have a lot of insecurity around this. Our world is set up, just like we talk with ITPs, for social environments. Well, with IFPs, it's set up to get things done, to go to your job, to accomplish tasks in the outer world. Like, you're measured on the things you do, not who you are. And so for IFPs moving through the world, this can be deeply challenging for them.
Yeah. In some ways, it's easy to figure out how IFPs are triggered, because IFPs don't hide their triggers. When they get triggered, they let you know usually. And so this might be one of the easiest ones to observe. And in some ways, that's good, right? There's what crosses you supports you, and what supports you crosses you. If you are associated with your feelings around things and you can experience every time you get triggered, because a lot of these types we're talking about, ETPs, we don't know when we get triggered. We're like, oh yeah, I guess I was upset back then, right? Because we're not associated with how we feel when we're feeling it.
The rest of us know when you get triggered sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, everybody else knows. I just don't know. You were really upset back there. I was? Well, you went at him pretty hard. I did? Right? It's like, oh, I guess so. So in some ways, it's kind of nice that I'm not getting triggered all the time, but how would I know if I was, right? For IFPs, it does seem like there's a disproportionate amount of times that they get triggered, but that's just because they're aware of it every time. Yeah. And so in some ways, they have maybe one of the most sophisticated tools, or access to the tool that gets them into the shadow, which is why, maybe some of my best mentors around shadow work have been IFPs, right? Because they're like, there's the way, it's paved. So how that shows up for them in their 3-year-old or inferior, though, is the classic, why do I have to prove my value in my career or job? Why can't I have value as a person? Why do I have to produce things? Why do I have to go out and have a job that I hate? Why do I have to have career capital? And there's this sense that, it's like, if I have to prove my value and worth in this way, well, then the system is the problem. It's like, well, everybody needs to interface with the outside world. And so the attitude about having like this kind of jacked up, what you'd call a persona, or the interfacing with the outside world, the attitude, the damn the man, that's pretty classic IFP, dealing with that extroverted thinking or effectiveness 3-year-old. I think another way it can show up too is when they put themselves in positions of leadership and management, which I think actually happens more than people understand or give them credit for. I know lots of IFPs that are in positions of leadership. And whenever that happens and you push against their leadership or tell them they're doing a bad job or that they're not keeping up with all of it, and you question that part, that can sometimes be highly triggering because it's a place of deep uncertainty. Now, oftentimes it's because they don't have the system set up that they need to have. They're relying on their driver function of introverted feeling or authenticity to inspire, to be a model for what they want other people to see, to understand the people who are working with them and give them one-on-one attention. They're leaning hard on those parts of their personality. And so when you say, but you don't have, like the system set up, like this department is a mess. It's like you need to be putting resources to this thing, right? Or you don't have it set up well enough. Ooh, that can be a real hit against an IFP that isn't the anarchist damn the mankind, is the kind that like really wants to make something of themselves and have an impact.
I think another thing too is to insinuate that they are lazy or non-industrious can be very triggering. And especially because I think a lot of IFPs, how they account for not necessarily knowing how, like not having the proficiency to set up external systems that can run on their own and just handle a lot of the deliverables for them. That's not their skill. They might be able to operate one of those systems, but setting it up, managing it, it can be stressful. So what IFPs often do is they stay busy a lot. They keep in motion to keep doing a lot of things. If I just keep doing things, they might say to themselves, all of this will get done. I'll have all the results I want. So to somebody that may be working all the time, 12-hour days, but the results aren't there, but they're still putting the work in, to insinuate they don't get things done or they're lazy or something like this could be deeply triggering because they see themselves, they're experiencing their world as busy, moving, and doing a lot all the time. So I think that's another access to the shadow for IFPs.
Yeah. And finally, sorry, IFPs, you've given us a lot of material because we know all the things that drive you crazy because you let us know. And I think finally, being accused of being irrational.
Yeah.
That can be really, really triggering to an IFP.
Or being required to show proof for the feelings they have. Like metricize these complex emotions you're feeling about this thing. And now it's like, that's triggering to me.
Yeah. Well, and the insinuation that I haven't put any thought into it.
Yeah.
I'm just emotionally driven. Well, and again, the gatekeeper is there to prevent somebody from looking at what's going on under the surface. And a lot of times FI users in general, but IFPs in particular, need to make peace with the fact that even if they do the math, if their feeling goes against the math, they're going to choose their feelings, not the math. And that's usually the thing they're trying to run away from, believing that will be highly discrediting to the outside world. And that's usually the thing that's triggering, which is I care a little too much about other people's opinions of the conclusions I've come to, even though I don't really want to acknowledge that. Same thing with the ITPs. Like 80, 90% of the time, they don't give two craps about what society thinks about them. And then that 10 to 20%, it's all they care about. Right. And so it's that part of them that they don't want to see how much they care, how much this means something to them. And that's usually the content that's living in the shadow, which is, well, what if you did care? What would that look like? Would it change anything? Is it okay to care? Or how do you integrate that part of who you are?
All right, let's talk about EJ's last but not least. So on the firm model, freedom, invulnerability, rightness, management, one of the ways that EJs handle their world is they take management, control over their environment often. So that's why we've put them down as management. These are ENTJs, ESTJs, ESFJs, and ENFJs in the Myers-Briggs system. Let's talk about the ENFJ and the ESFJ first. They both share the dominant or driver cognitive function of extroverted feeling or harmony is what we've nicknamed it. Again, it's focused on social rules, connection, boundaries, all sorts of social things, right? We just covered it in the last section.
Relatedness.
Yeah. In the backseat at the 3-year-old inferior level for EFJs is the cognitive function technically called introverted thinking. We've nicknamed it accuracy. Again, at the 3-year-old level, accuracy is a little bit uncertain about all the data, all the principal component parts that can't be distilled any further. Sometimes EFJs have a difficult time letting go of the narrative and just holding and sitting with the information itself. And often anything that would insinuate to an EFJ that they haven't put thought into something, if their intelligence is called into question, their logic, like the way they process or logic through a solution or a thought, sometimes this can be deeply triggering to their shadow material.
Yeah, if they get pushed back on their beliefs, right, and the things that they feel like they've thought about and figured out, if there's some pushback. I think these are pretty classical EFJ triggers, right? Like this idea of like a person insinuating that they're not as intelligent or they don't know as much about the topics that they're interested in. Because a lot of times EFJs have done a ton of research, a ton of thinking, consulted a lot of expert opinion on it.
Sometimes highly credentialed.
Often, right? EFJs are the ones that you walk into their office and they've got like 20 different certificates hanging, behind on their wall behind their desk chair. So they're usually highly credentialed. But I think there's an attempt to offset that ability to be triggered, like by questioning their competence, their content, their ability to know and understand, and their access to all this data and information. There does tend to be a desire to get the credential to prove that the outer world gave me a stamp of approval on what I know. And so that's leaning on extroverted feeling or harmony, like the social systems and institutions set up in order to give me that mark of approval to offset any insecurity or uncertainty I would feel in my 3-year-old function. But I think the one that's really been coming up for me over and over is that introverted thinking or accuracy is a function that wants the truth no matter how bad it hurts. And because of that, it tends to be an almost relentless critic. Now, we've talked about an inner mean girl voice. Doesn't matter what your gender is. You have an inner mean girl voice if you have introverted thinking or accuracy as a 3-year-old function. You just can't get rid of it. And that mean voice, that critical voice, is something that is a little too easy to push on. It's a little too easy to trigger. And in large part because that voice is actually intended to be a friend. The higher up it is in the stack, like for ITPs, they want to know, how am I failing? How am I doing it wrong? I want to optimize myself. I want to do better. Like, don't soft sell it. Tell me how it is. Like, I want to know because I want to perform and I want to have optimized performance. So the voice that goes, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, you did this wrong, is a friend when it's a driver function. By the time it gets to your 3-year-old in that place of crippling uncertainty, it is an enemy, right? It is the voice of an enemy. You did this wrong and you did this wrong and you did this wrong. And the FJ is like, oh my God, I can't even like get it out of my head because there's already this sense that I'm doing everything wrong, right? Because of that voice. And so it's actually not difficult to trigger at all. In fact, it might be one of the easiest to start questioning them, to start pushing back against their logic, to start questioning whether or not that they're being honest with themselves, whether or not they're being honest with others. Just accuse them of lying. And when that is a very easy way to trigger an EFJ. I'm not saying go do it, right? Because it's a terrible thing to do on purpose. But if you are an EFJ, one of the good things to know is that these triggers have a lot of content and data living underneath them if you can make peace with them, but you have to sit in the uncertainty of it. And that's the thing with all of these functions. There's so much uncertainty that comes with them. It's hard to just sit with it, to sit with the trigger because it comes along with this it's an icky feeling. It feels gross, right? It almost feels icky and gross to be so uncertain about this part of who you are. And yet underneath lives a system of, are you borrowing other people's belief structures and not thinking what you authentically believe? Are you letting yourself off the hook because you're comparing yourself to other people as opposed to comparing yourself against your own standards? Is this relentless voice a voice of your own standards for yourself that you're not matching? And is it because you've borrowed these standards from others, or are they true for you and you need to get work to match them? It's like, oh, it's so much content. It's so much to get through. It's so difficult. And yet there is a real opportunity to listen to that voice, even though it can feel brutal.
So when we talk about ENTJ and ESTJ personality types, both of these personalities lead with a cognitive function technically called extroverted thinking. nicknamed it effectiveness. And again, this is about outer world metrics, what works, what gets the job done, measuring things, applying thinking to the outside world. Opposite of that, at the 3-year-old inferior place for both of these personality types lives the cognitive function, technically called introverted feeling. We've nicknamed it authenticity. And for ETJ types, this is again a place of deep uncertainty. It's about identity, about emotional processing. A big one for ETJs is intent. When someone suggests to an ETJ that they had bad intent for an action they took, man, that could be deeply triggering for them. Mm-hmm. They can just immediately get to a triggered place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Questioning intent is a big one, I think. And, unlike the IFPs that'll let you know when you trigger them, ETJs tend to hold their cards close to the vest. So you're going to have to poke the bear a lot in order to get this kind of content out of them, what's triggering to them. And to extroverted thinking or effectiveness, you don't give away that kind of information because it can be weaponized against you. So if you're an ETJ, you might have to connect this to your own life experience. Obviously, all the types do. But you might have to really be looking out for it because you might be hiding it even from yourself.
Well, and I would say that a suggestion of complex intent can also be something triggering, because I think ETJs, they would prefer, if you could, just see very simple, like yes, no, that was good intent, bad intent is the level I think a lot of ETJs wish they could see this part of themselves and other people. Mm-hmm. But when you suggest like, well, that person had both good intent and bad intent blended, it's really a mixture of both. It's a complex intent structure. Sometimes just that idea can be triggering to ETJs because it threatens the thing that they want, which is management and control of their environment. Complexity really obscures that. It makes it difficult to gain command or control of a situation because now nuance means you can't just set a standard and forget it. You have to take each incident in its contextual meaning and its like localized implication. You can't just abstract it and say, well, this is how it's always going to be, one size fits all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that especially if an ETJ hasn't done very much work with their 3-year-old or inferior, it's real shadow work. I think that becomes a real problem, is that complexity, right? Like just keep everything really simple. I think though that what lives in there is a more complex idea of their own identity and all of those nuances that you're referring to. And so I think another thing that can be highly triggering is anytime you put their identity in a tailspin, anytime you question their identity, you get them to question their own identity. If they're in a place where you are insinuating that they actually don't know themselves very well, and you've poked something or kind of hit a button that made them question whether or not they like maybe a personality type, or maybe a relationship in their lives, or maybe their relationship to, not necessarily a paradigm, but who they are inside of that. Maybe they have what's called role person merger, which is their identity is completely wrapped up in this role in society they're filling, and you take that away from them or get them to question whether or not they know who they are outside of those roles. Oh, that can be really triggering and really destabilizing. I think on top of that is questioning their ethics, right? And there is a tendency for ETJs, and they don't always let you know. Sometimes they'll let you know. Sometimes they'll say this, but you can usually tell in their demeanor. They have a real soft spot for the underdog. ETJs do. They like that's something that introverted feeling or authenticity gives to all users of that function. Yeah. Is a soft spot for the underdog. And at the exclusion of others, right? Extroverted feeling or harmony wants everybody to get their needs met, but introverted feeling or authenticity is specifically focused on the underdog. And it's because they sympathize with somebody who's been neglected, set aside, thrown away, right? That thing has value, and we're just not seeing it. So if you insinuate that the ETJ is cold or heartless, if you attack the underdog, that will be highly triggering, right? If they think that the underdog is being treated poorly. Or if you insinuate that they are cold and they identify with somebody who is not cold because they have that compassion and sympathy for the underdog, that can itself be highly triggering as well. This idea that they, that they're not nice people, right? That they're just stepping on top of the vulnerable to get to where they want to be.
So as we went through all the different personality types, we just looked at the 3-year-old inferior function. We didn't talk about every possible way you and your type could be triggered. We just started here as a quick reference point just to get an idea of the things you might be triggered around in your personality. And we wanted to show you how it's an access point. The material that surfaces when you get triggered allows you to see your shadow and the shadow material that's coming up for you so that you can actually process that, work through it, grow past it, and become a better version of yourself on an ongoing timeline.
Yeah, and this language for it, like you said, Joel, this is not an exhaustive list, right? It's not comprehensive. We as individuals are going to get triggered by all sorts of things, right? Things that don't necessarily have a one-to-one correlation with type, and it doesn't all add up. But what understanding the system does is it shines a light, like it points us in a direction that goes, that's a thing that might be happening to you. And now that we have language for it, we have one degree of separation from it. Not that like I'm a terrible person who keeps getting triggered or you're a terrible person because you keep triggering me. But this is a phenomena that happens. And do you identify with the phenomena? That one degree of separation, that space from the self and the phenomena, a lot of times gives us just the amount of space we need to be able to start identifying these things and go, oh, that's right, this is content. There's a system running under all of this. There is information about myself that lives in this experience, in this phenomena. And I can when you get triggered, by the way, the moment it happens, you're not doing any sort of processing.
Yeah.
Especially in early days. If you haven't done a bunch of trigger processing in the early days, you're just getting triggered, right? And so you're going to have to, do the do and ride the wave. Like you're just there and you're mad and you hate everybody and you hate yourself. And then when things get a little quieter, as opposed to doing what we always do, which is forgive and forget and push it away and kick the can to the side and keep it all in the shadow, as opposed to doing that, now we know maybe I should reevaluate that. Maybe I should study it. There's a pattern here of how it could be affecting me. How's that pattern playing out in my subjective experience, in my personal experience? And how can I make a little bit more space to be able to see what's going on? What's the inner work I need to be doing to really understand myself here? And where might I have some dissonance with myself? Where might I be allowing myself to be a bit of a fantasist about who I am and not making peace with some of these components that point out that I'm not so good here? I need to own that I'm not great at this. I need to own the dissonance inside of myself. So at the time the trigger happens, especially if you've not really done much of this work, there's no anticipation that you're going to get it on the first try. You're not even going to get it on the 300th try. Like everybody gets triggered. We call it a minute to be human, right? You stub your toe, it hurts. Ow. If for a minute you're swearing at the thing that you just, stubbed your toe on. And that happens with triggers all the time. So it's not like you're going to get to a place where if you're triggered, you're going to somehow beautifully get through it. It's that if you do this work, first of all, you get triggered a lot less. Second, you get to meet aspects of yourself that are hidden in shadows and start to gain more territory about who you are. And third, when you have a trigger, you're not hiding from it, running from it, projecting it out as other people are the bad guy, introjecting it and making yourself the bad guy. You're just taking it as it is, even if that happens a couple hours later when you cool off.
I'm glad you said a minute to be human, because I want to walk through a little bit of a how-to here, just to make sure to land this in a practical way for you listening. When a trigger happens, a minute to be human is great. If you can give yourself a full minute before you respond, that's awesome. And what you're doing is you're slowing the timeline down. So something happens, a trigger moment happens. If you can just not react to the situation, but instead create a time delay and respond to the situation, you're already light years ahead of how you were before. So one of the things that I've really practiced on is when I get triggered, I just slow the process down as much as I can. That's the first step, is to slow everything down and do not react.
Go into like an emotional or a psychological bullet time.
Exactly. And then the next thing that in that moment that I'm slowing everything down, I'm immediately identifying that, yes, I was triggered. Number two, I want to approach it now with two primary energies: the energy of gratitude, thank you for this information, and the energy of curiosity. What could it mean? Those are the two energies that I'm going in with. Now, when you're in the emotional state of a trigger, you shouldn't necessarily go and explore what it means. It's just to anchor those things in, to say, I'm grateful for this. Clearly, there's information here for me. What you actually want to do at the end of stretching that time is to process the emotion in the moment through some technology: tapping, meditation, breath work, EPR, which is emotional process release, something that you can deal with the heightened emotional state. Because if that emotional state gets a hold of you, you won't be able to respond. You'll instead react. So you stretch the time out, you approach it with the energy of curiosity and gratitude, and then you deal with the emotion in the moment, because you can't unpack the content of the shadow until you get through the experience you're having. You know, your flesh is hot to the touch, and your brain is on fire, and your pupils are dilated. You're focused on the issue at hand, and the emotions are rising up in your chest and your body, and you feel it all over yourself viscerally, or whatever the experience. It might be sadness, grief, anger, whatever the emotion is. You need to process that right there. And then at that point, when you've processed the emotion, now you have a reference point of something that triggered you and brought up information. Now, once the emotion has been handled, now we can start to look at that and say, what do I need to do to address this directly with this information? You might want to journal about it. You might want to write it down. You might want to capture that to then start doing some personal growth work around this new information that was presented to you. Now, often it's not new information. Often this is a trigger that's probably happened over and over again. But with this new awareness from listening to this podcast and taking some of these ideas to your life, it is somewhat new information, because it's information that now you feel you can do something about. You have agency over to, again, process through it. And there's short-term, in the moment, emotional process and release, or processing the emotion. And then there's long-term addressing the actual shadow material over time, which takes, like you said, Antonia, that takes a while. You can process the emotions right now, but everything that led to those emotions might still need to be addressed over time.
Yeah. When you have introverted feeling or authenticity, sometimes it's a little easier to slow your emotions down. As a person who uses extroverted feeling or harmony, my corollary to what you just mentioned is to leave the physical space that the emotion was created, because it's almost like the emotion gets locked into a physical space. And so one of the things that I've done with you is that when I get triggered, and if you're the person who, quote unquote, was the catalyst, you were the trigger, you're not the problem, but you were the catalyst. In those moments, I have set an expectation that if I am too upset, I need to physically leave. Now, sometimes I'm terrible at it. I just want to spew piss and vinegar, and I stick around, and I shouldn't, right? Because it's not a minute to be human. It's like 25 minutes to be human. But in those moments, the smartest thing I can do is to go, what I say is, I'm not hanging up the phone. Right? That's our sort of safe phrase, which is I need to physically leave the space. Now, I say I'm not hanging up the phone because you had a relationship with somebody in the past that when you guys got in an argument, she'd hang up the phone, and then it was over. And when I left the room, you were like, you're hanging up the phone on me metaphorically. And I'm like, I'm not hanging up the phone. I just have to physically leave. Yeah. And so a lot of times for me, one of the best ways to control my emotions, or at least not project onto you things that I actually need to introspect about myself, is to say, I'm not hanging up the phone, set that expectation, and then physically remove myself for, sometimes it's like 3 to 5 minutes, and then I'm much better.
Yeah.
So that can also work, as to just either slow things down or physically leave the space.
I think that's a great point you just made, because basically you're saying I already have a automatic scripted response when I'm triggered and I feel like I'm about ready to react. I have an already decided upon action, which is to remove myself from that space if possible. And the moment I do that, then I can start to reflect and respond rather than react. So this is the other thing you might want to do. If you have a hard time slowing that process down, you might want to already know what your plan of attack is going to be when a trigger happens, implement your plan immediately, and then regroup, and then do the other things I talked about. So that's a mechanism to maybe slow it down. You might have to take an action to slow down your response time or your reaction time, which is totally valid. I mean, whatever works for you and how you're wired as a person, I think that's a great thing. So we kind of gone through, we talked about last episode, all the different types of like ways to look at triggers. What does it mean? What do we mean by it? In this episode, we talked about applying it specifically to type clusters, different personality types, and we looked at it through the lens of the inferior or 3-year-old cognitive function in your personality. What do you think? What's coming up for you? What is surfacing? What's triggering you, quote unquote, or what's at least sparking thoughts or emotions in you? We'd love to hear from you. You haven't been able to talk to us. You haven't had a microphone in this conversation, but we want to hear what your thoughts and feelings are about this. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, you can leave a question, a comment. More importantly, you can share your story, a personal story about an experience around something maybe you were triggered around, how your personality type relates to triggers, something like this. It can be powerful because it gives us a glimpse into the lived experience of your life. And so other people can hear that, share their experience with you, and it can get a community conversation going around this idea.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you're watching us on YouTube, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it in all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating and review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out. If you leave a review for us on iTunes for our podcast, that would be amazing. And if you want to leave a comment on the YouTube channel, that would be amazing as well. We have a host of programs that are personal growth oriented through the lens of personality type. In fact, we have a program that we're very excited about called the Life Path program, or a personality life path. So go check out that program as well as the individual personality owners manuals and see which one of those programs is right for you.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.